When we think about the connection between Tanakh and the natural world, there are several different aspects of that relationship. One is drawing inspiration from the beauty and wonder of the natural world. There are several pasukim in Tanakh which reflect this theme. Ma godlu ma'asecha Hashem, how great are your works, God. Ma rabu ma'asecha Hashem, how manifold are your works, God. And there's definitely an important theme that we're supposed to contemplate the natural world and draw inspiration from it. The Gemara expands upon this theme, and the Gemara says that when you see an incredible animal such as an elephant, there's a special bracha that you make in it. Baruch Meshana Habriot. Blessed is the one who creates such extraordinary creatures. But as I mentioned, it's not only the biggest animals that are a source of inspiration. There are also smaller animals which are highlighted for being extraordinary. In Mishlei, there are 4 animals highlighted for being small and yet ingenious. For example, Smamit, the gecko. However, as important as it is to draw inspiration from the beauty and wonder of God's creation, this is only one relatively minor aspect of the connection between Tanakh and the natural world. A much larger aspect is considering the actual range of animals that are described in Tanakh, their identities and their significance. Join me in a tour through the rest of the Biblical Museum of Natural History as we encounter the animal world of the Bible. You're not going to find in Tanakh any reference to pandas, polar bears, or to penguins. Why not? The reason is that different animals appear in different parts of the world. And Tanakh took place in a very specific part of the world. This part of the world, the land of Israel and the surrounding regions. This idea that different parts of the world have different animals, and that the animals of Tanakh are therefore going to be specifically the animals from one region, not the animals that you find everywhere else. It's a very important point. In fact, it is the crucial foundational principle of biblical natural history. And it's something that until very recently nobody realized. In fact, until about 200 years ago, nobody in the world realized that every part of the world has its own specific types of animals. People knew that there was the occasional very exotic animal that's only found in one place. But by and large, people thought that generally speaking, you'll find more or less the same animals everywhere. Only once Australia was discovered did people start looking at everything a bit more carefully and realize that different parts of the world have very different arrangements of animals. But still, the ramifications of that for the animals of the Bible were still often not appreciated by people. It's very important, it's crucial to remember that everybody grasps the natural world based on what part of the world they live in, and the animals that live in that part of the world. And that point is brought out very beautifully in this display behind me. This is a display of model Noah's Arks that come from different parts of the world. In every part of the world, when people are making the animals to go in their model Noah's Arks, what animals do they think of? They think of the animals that they are familiar with, which, generally speaking, is the animals from the part of the world where they live. This ark here was made in Kenya from banana fiber, and the animals are exclusively African animals. And there's the wildebeest, and the bush pigs, and the warthogs. Here behind me is an Asian ark, where the architecture of the ark itself is Asian, and the animals are things such as Asian water buffaloes and Asian elephants, rather than the African elephants that you'll normally see in an ark. So, ironically, as beautiful as these model Noah's Arks are, none of them exhibit the animal world of the Bible. Once we've established that the animal world of the Bible are the animals of the land of Israel and the surrounding regions, so you might think that makes things much simpler. We can just go touring Israel, looking at the wildlife, and that'll be biblical natural history. But the truth is that it's not so simple. One of the most common birds that you'll see in Israel today is the darara, the ringneck parakeet. You see them everywhere, very beautiful, very noisy, very prominent. And yet, even though they are one of the most prominent birds in Israel, they're not mentioned anywhere in Tanakh. And the reason for that is that they're an invasive species. They're from India. They were imported many decades ago by pet stores. They escaped from the pet stores, and started spreading rapidly in the wild here. And the fact is, there's many other creatures like that. Myna birds, red-eared slider turtles, nutria. So you can't extrapolate from the animals that you see in Israel today and presume that those are part of the animal world of the Bible. There are many animals living in Israel today which did not live here in biblical times and therefore are not mentioned in Tanakh. But in contrast to that, there are many animals that are mentioned in Tanakh which used to live here but which don't live here anymore. This is the skull of an animal that's mentioned in the book of Iyov, where it's called a behemoth, not as the plural of the word behemah, but as a singular form, the behemoth. And for a long time, the translators of Tanakh did not know how to identify this animal. So instead of translating the word behemoth, they transliterated it as behemoth. And that's how the word behemoth entered the English language to mean a large, monstrous creature of unspecified identity. But if we look at the Pesukim, we can figure out what it is. It's described as a gigantic animal with a huge mouth. It's described as being an animal that lives in swamps and the rivers. And yet, despite these enormous teeth, it's described as being a herbivore. What is it? It's the hippopotamus. Nowadays, we think of hippos as being African animals, but thousands of years ago, they lived here in the land of Israel, in the rivers up and down the coast. Another example is the bear, right here behind me. Bears are mentioned several times in Tanakh, and they lived here until more recently. 1917 was the year when the last wild bear in the land of Israel was killed. Up on the wall over here is the hide of a leopard. Now, leopards lived here until extremely recently. Within the last 20 years, there were still wild leopards in Israel. The last ones were killed in Ein Gedi, in the Judean desert. Now, why is it important to learn about the animals of Tanakh? So, several reasons. First of all, it helps us understand Tanakh. The Nevi'im mention many different animals in order to convey different ideas and messages and symbolism. If we don't know what these animals are and what these animals do, we're not going to be able to understand the messages and the symbolism that the Nevi'im were giving over. Another reason why it's important to identify the animals of Tanakh is that it gives us an insight into the natural history of the land of Israel, how this land used to look before the encroachment of civilization. But here at the Biblical Museum of Natural History, we believe that the most important idea, the most important concept in identifying the animals of Tanakh is something that nobody really thinks about, and that's cultural identity. There's many different nations in the world, and every nation has animals that are part of its cultural identity, that it speaks about and learns from and does art about, even names its children after. So which animals are part of our cultural heritage? It's not the gefilte fish or the chicken soup. The lions, the hippos, the bears, the leopards. These are not animals from New York or from England or from the shtetl in Europe. They are animals that lived in biblical Israel. So learning about the animals of Tanakh is another aspect of our connection with the land of Israel. So what did the land of Israel used to look like in biblical times? Let's enter our Hall of Biblical Wildlife and find out. This is a scene that looks like it might be Africa. This is the animal world of the Bible. The land of Israel was home to a very unusual cross-section of animals. Because Israel is at the center of the world, not just spiritually or politically or historically, but geographically, it's where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet. So the animals that lived here were a very unique combination. There were African animals that lived here, like lions and hippos. There were Asian animals like onagers, a type of wild ass. There were European animals like bears and deer. These are the animals of the Bible, the animals that formed a crucial part of our cultural heritage. The animals that the Nevi'im used to convey ideas and symbols and teachings. And if we're going to understand these ideas and symbols and teachings, we've got to know what these animals are. The tzvi is an animal that appears many times in Tanakh. And many people identify it confidently as the deer, the hirsch. However, in fact, we know that that cannot be the case. The Gemara points out that the horns of a tzvi are not branched, but the horns, the antlers of a deer, are branched. So right there, Rashi says it must be that what we call a tzvi is not what the Torah calls a tzvi. Which is the animal called tzvi in Tanakh? The gazelle, this beautiful animal right here. So again, we're faced with the question, if the tzvi is really the gazelle, how come so many people identify it as a deer? In order to answer that question, I'm going to give you the key to biblical natural history. When Israelis go to America for the first time, what are they most excited to see, apart from the shopping? Squirrels. Israelis go nuts about squirrels. Why? Because here in Israel, you don't see any. As we mentioned earlier, different parts of the world have different animals. The animals of Tanakh are the animals of the region of the land of Israel, which are not the same as the animals of America or of Europe. Here in Israel, we have both gazelles and deer, the tzvi and the ayal. In Europe, on the other hand, there's lots and lots of deer, but no gazelles. So when Jews were in Europe, they transferred the name tzvi from the gazelle to the deer, because that's what they had. What's interesting then is if you look at English translations of the phrase tzvi va'ayal, which appears several times in Tanakh, so they'll translate tzvi as deer, and then they get to the word ayal, and you can tell they've gotten stuck because they already used the word deer. So they'll say a hind. But a hind is just a doe, a deer, a female deer. See, they're struggling with the fact that they only know of one animal. You see the same thing in the name Naphtali Tzvi. Right, Naphtali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin is the most famous person who held that name. Now, why do the names Naphtali and Tzvi go together? So people say, it's because of the bracha. But what was the bracha that Yaakov gave Naphtali? It was Naphtali Ayala Shlucha, not Naphtali Tzvi Shlucha. But again, in Europe and in America, they're only familiar with one animal, the deer. So they all got conflated. Everything was the tzvi, the hirsch. But in fact, in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, there are two different animals. The tzvi, the gazelle, and the ayal, the deer. One of the animals mentioned several times in Tanakh is the Shual, always translated as the fox. Here's a beautiful fox right here. One of the most famous instances of the Shual in Tanakh is the story of Shimshon, who caught 300 Shualim, tied firebrands to the tails, and set them through the fields of the Pelishtim. But the early Bible critics ridiculed this story. They said, how would Shimshon even find 300 foxes, let alone catch them? Foxes are solitary creatures. You might find a pair, but there won't be any others for miles around. But the truth is that the Shual of Tanakh is not the fox. How do we know that? Well, aside from the story of Shimshon, there are also Pesukim which describe Shualim as eating bodies of people who were killed in battle. Foxes don't do that. But there's another animal, very similar to the fox, in the same family, a bit bigger, and they do eat dead bodies, and they travel in huge packs. And that is the jackal. The jackal is the Shual of Tanakh. So if the jackal is the real Shual, then how is it that everybody translates Shual as fox? And in modern Hebrew, Shual means fox. The jackal is known as Tan in modern Hebrew. The center of studying Tanakh was moved to Europe. In Europe, they don't have any jackals, so they transferred the name to the closest animal they had, which was the fox. That's how it happened that Shual was translated as fox, and that's how, when they were reviving Hebrew as a language, the name Shual had still gotten stuck to the fox for all those centuries we were in Europe, and therefore, for the jackal, they used the name Tan, which is an alternate name for jackals, which appears in Tanakh. Minisharim kalu, me'arayot gaveru. The nesher is something that is very prominent in Tanakh as the king of birds. However, it's difficult to understand what the references to it are. They were lighter than eagles. Eagles are very heavy birds. But the truth is, the nesher of Tanakh is actually not an eagle. How do we know that? Because there are other Pesukim describing the nesher as being bald. Eagles are not bald. Even the famous American bald eagle, lovely head of hair, just has white feathers in its head. And also we find a description of the nesher as feeding on carrion, dead animals. It's the griffin vulture. The griffin vulture is the largest, most magnificent bird of prey in this part of the world. It's the highest flying bird, the lord of the air. Look in the Guinness Book of Records. You'll see the altitude record for a bird is held by a griffin vulture, which hit an airplane at 37,000 feet. But what happened? It's the same story as with the other animals. In Ashkenaz, they didn't have any griffin vultures. It was the eagle that was the king of birds. So the name was transferred. And here we see the importance of correctly identifying the creature. The idea of a nesher being kal is impossible to understand if we're talking about an eagle. But once you realize that we're talking about a griffin vulture, then we can understand what it means. It's not speaking about how much the bird weighs, it's speaking about how they fly. When you see a griffin vulture fly, you see how effortless it is. They soar to this tremendous altitude without once flapping their wings. Because they're living in hot countries, there's thermals of air rising up over the rocks that have been heated up, and the griffin vulture soars effortlessly up to the heights. So that's the idea of being light as a griffin vulture. They're doing it effortlessly, rising up graciously, effortlessly, soaring to the highest heights. Baruch Nafshi, Tehillim Kuf Daled that we recite in Rosh Chodesh has many descriptions of the beauty of the natural world. And we have this pasuk, Harim hagvohim layelim, Salaim machse l'shfanim. The high hills are for the Ya'elim, the ibex, and the pasuk continues, Salaim machse l'shfanim. The rocks are a hiding place for the shfanim. Now what is a shafan? So in most English translations it will say coney, which is an old English word for the rabbit. And that's what shafan means in modern Hebrew too. We have the famous song, Ha-shafan ha-katan shchach lisko ha-delet. But the shafan of this pasuk cannot be a rabbit. First of all, it says here that shfanim hide in rocks. Rabbits don't hide in rocks, they hide in burrows. Plus, there are no rabbits in the Middle East. So how do we know what these shfanim are? So the pasuk tells us two things about them. Number one, we know they hide in rocks. Number two, we see that they're associated with Ya'elim, with ibex. Now, the place in Israel that's most famous for ibex is Ein Gedi, the spring of the goat, the place where we're told that David HaMelech was actually hiding out amongst the Ya'elim, amongst the ibex. And if you go to Ein Gedi, even today, you'll see the ibex on the hills, just as the pasuk describes, and you'll also see shfanim, little creatures hiding in the rocks. In English, they're called rock hyraxes. Hello. There are also many smaller animals mentioned in Tanakh, such as in the list of the Shmona Sharatzim, the 8 creeping creatures that transmit tumah if you touch a dead one. And with these smaller creatures, it's often a very big challenge to identify them. See, in general, when it comes to identifying an animal in Tanakh, how are you supposed to know what it is? So in some cases, we have clues. Right? We're told that the nesher is bald and feeds on carrion, so that helps us figure out that it's referring to a griffin vulture. In other cases, there may be a very clear, universal, unequivocal tradition. But with many of these smaller animals, they're only mentioned once, and there are multiple different traditions. How are we supposed to know what they are? And the answer is, very often, we don't know. However, when we consider the various different traditions, we can make an estimate as to which are more reliable. Let's take, for example, the tsav. Now, every kid in Israel knows what a tsav is. It's a turtle, what we in England call a tortoise. But again, just because the turtle is called tsav in modern Hebrew, that's not necessarily what it is in biblical Hebrew. Yes, there were some medieval commentaries who identified the tsav of the Torah as the turtle. However, Rav Sadia Gaon says that the tsav of the Torah is the Euromastix lizard. These are lizards that live in the desert. And once again, these lizards do not live in Europe. One of the ways of identifying animals of Tanakh is looking at their names in regional languages. And that's what Rav Sadia Gaon did. In local languages, these animals are called tsav. So that helps us identify it as the tzav of Tanakh. And in modern Hebrew, therefore, they call this cherdon tzav. When we look at the identifications given of these small animals, we see an enormous difference between the list given by, say, Rashi and the list given by Rav Sadia Gaon. Why is there that huge difference? Well, it's because Rashi lived in France and Rav Sadia Gaon lived here. So they were exposed to totally different types of animals. Tin Shemet, the barn owl, appears in the list of non-kosher birds. However, the word Tin Shemet also appears in the list of the Shmona Shuratzim, the small creatures and reptiles that transmit tumah. So how can the same creature appear in both lists? The answer is it's not the same creature. The Tin Shemet in the list of Shmona Shuratzim is a reptile, but it's going to be something that shares something in common with the barn owl, which will help us identify it. So it seems to me that the Tin Shemet in the list of Shmona Shuratzim is the chameleon. Now, what do chameleons have in common with barn owls? So this chameleon here, he's pretty tame. But if you were to approach a wild chameleon, the first thing he would do is gape and hiss at you. Are you going to do that to me? Go on, do your gaping and hissing shtick. No, he won't do it, he's too tame. But trust me, that's what wild chameleons do. And that's exactly what barn owls do when you approach them on the nest. They gape and hiss. So, these two creatures have that feature in common, and that feature is linked to the name Tin Shemet. Tin Shemet may be based on the word neshima. These are two creatures which are distinct in the neshimot, the breathing and hissing that they do. So that helps us understand why they have the same name and helps us in identifying the Tin Shemet of the list of Shuratzim as the chameleon. The big message here is that biblical natural history is the history of the Jewish people. It's a consequence of the exile that we lost familiarity with the animal world of Tanakh. Now that we're back in our homeland, we can regain familiarity with the animals of Tanakh, which are the animals of our cultural heritage. Now, when we learn the Mishnah, Gibor Ka'ari, Azkanamer, Ratzketzvi, Kal Kanesher, we can know what these animals are, and we can understand what Chazal were teaching us. We know what it means to be Kal Kanesher. Now, when we name our kids Tzvi or Yael, we know what animals we're naming them after. But more than that, we can understand that the fact that we were learning and teaching and naming our children after these animals, all these millennia, even when we lived in countries where we didn't know exactly what these animals were, and sometimes got their identities mixed up, but we still held on to them because they were part of our cultural heritage. They're part of what connects us to our homeland, to the land of Israel.